Hello, and welcome back to Read Aloud with Dan. That's me. I'm Dan. Today we're continuing reading Marx's Wage, Labor, and Capital. I think I previously told you he wrote it in 1947. I think it's actually 1949. So there you go. And we're picking up where we left off yesterday. This next section here is the interests of capital and wage labor are diametrically opposed. And away we go. Marx says, "We thus see that, even if we keep ourselves within the relation of capital and wage labor, the interests of capitals," he says, "and the interests of wage labor are diametrically opposed to each other. A rapid growth of capital is synonymous with a rapid growth of profits. Profits can grow rapidly only when the price of labor, the relative wages, decrease just as rapidly. Relative wages may fall, although real wages rise simultaneously with nominal wages, with the money value of labor, provided only that the real wage does not rise in the same proportion as the profit. If, for instance, in good business years, wages rise 5%, while profits rise 30%, the proportional, the relative wage, has not increased, but decreased. This is how capitalism can make you think you're making more money than you really are. How you can actually make more money than you did the year before, but afford fewer things. He says, if therefore the income of the worker increased with the rapid growth of capital, there is at the same time a widening of the social chasm that divides the worker from the capitalist, and increase in the power of capital over labor, a greater dependence of labor upon capital. So capitalism grows stronger. To say that the worker has an interest in the rapid growth of capital means only this, that the more speedily the worker augments the wealth of the capitalist, the larger will be the crumbs which fall to him. The greater will be the number of workers that can be called into existence. The more can the mass of slaves dependent upon capital be increased. He's not saying that the worker has an interest in the growth of capital. Uh, uh, you know, it, you have to read between the lines here. Um, he means we get crumbs. We're slaves. This is not ideal, he's saying. It's sort of clearly implied. He says that we've thus seen that even the most favorable situation for the working class, namely the most rapid growth of capital, however much it may improve the material life of the worker, does not abolish the antagonism between his interests and the interests of the capitalist. Profit and wages remain as before in inverse proportion. If capital grows rapidly, wages may rise, but the profit of capital rises disproportionately faster. The material position of the worker has improved, but at the cost of his social position. The social chasm that separates him from the capitalist has widened. There it is. Finally, to say that the most favorable condition for wage labor is the fastest possible growth of productive capital, that is the same as to say the quicker the working class multiplies and augments the power inimical to it, the wealth of another which lords over that class, the more favorable will be the conditions under which it will be permitted to toil anew at the multiplication of bourgeois wealth, at the enlargement of the power of capital, content thus to forge for itself the golden chains by which the bourgeoisie drags it in its train. Oh man, that's just chef's kiss. Amazing. He says, growth of productive capital and rise of wages, are they really so indissolubly united as the bourgeois economists maintain? We must not believe their mere words. We dare not believe them, even when they claim that the fatter the capital is, the more will its slave be pampered. He's pulling no shots here. He says the bourgeoisie is too much enlightened. It keeps its accounts too much carefully to share the prejudices of the feudal lord, who makes an ostentatious display of the magnificence of his retinue. The conditions of existence of the bourgeoisie compel it to attend carefully to its bookkeeping. We must therefore examine more closely into the following question. In what manner does the growth of productive capital affect wages? I think he starts picking up a little bit of steam right here. Here we go. In what manner does the growth of productive capital affect wages? If, as a whole, the productive capital of bourgeois society grows, there takes place a more many-sided accumulation of labor. The individual capitals, you don't hear this term used in this way very much. Capitals. It's just, I guess that works. Capitals, yeah. The individual capitals increase in number and in magnitude. The multiplications of individual capitals increases the competition among capitalists. The increasing magnitude of increasing capitals provides the means of leading more powerful armies of workers with more gigantic instruments of war upon the industrial battlefield. The one capitalist can drive the other from the field and carry off his capital only by selling more cheaply. In order to sell more cheaply without ruining himself, he must produce more cheaply, that is, increase the productive forces of labor as much as possible. But the productive forces of labor is increased above all by a greater division of labor and by a more general introduction and constant improvement of machinery. The larger the army of workers upon whom the labor is subdivided, the more gigantic the scale upon which machinery is introduced, the more in proportion does the cost of production decrease, the more fruitful is the labor. And so, there arises among the capitalists a universal rivalry for for the increase of the division of labor and of machinery, and for their exploitation upon the greatest possible scale. Excuse me. If now, by a greater division of labor, by the application and improvement of new machines, by a more advantageous exploitation of the forces of nature on a larger scale, a capitalist has found the means of producing with the same amount of labor, whether it be direct or accumulated labor, a larger amount of products, of commodities than his competitors. If, for instance, he could produce a whole yard of linen in the same labor time in which his competitors weave half a yard, how will this capitalist act? And of course, he loves his yards of linen. He's so silly. It's silly, Marx. So what would you do if you could sell twice as much in the same amount of time? Or what would the capitalist do? Well, he, just bear with us here, he or she, whatever, they could keep on selling half a yard of linen at old market price, at the same price. But this would not have the effect of driving his opponents from the field and enlarging, that's not the word, enlarging his own market. So, okay, you're producing twice as much in the same amount of time, you could just keep the price the same. But what would that achieve? You would just achieve having more to sell. If you have the market for it, you'd make more money, you know? But sort of the point of it is to corner more of the market. And you can't do that without selling more dearly or cheaper than your competitor. If you're, generally, if you're selling like the same commodity of the same quality, you get the idea. We say generally to give us a little shortcut there. So, reading on here, it says, but his need of a market has increased in the same measure in which his productive power has extended. So he needs a bigger market to sell his goods. Maybe there's just a huge amount of demand, and you could do that. But one of the ways of creating a bigger market or having more of a market is by stealing your competitor's market. And you do that by selling more cheaply. He says the more powerful and costly means of production that he has called into existence enable him, it is true, to sell his wares more cheaply. But they compel him at the same time to sell more wares, to get control of a very much greater market for his commodities. Consequently, this capitalist will sell his half yard of linen more cheaply than his competitors. This is how capitalism works. He's telling you. But the capitalist will not sell the whole yard so cheaply as his competitors sell the half yard, although the production of the whole yard costs him no more than does that of the half yard to the others. Otherwise, he would make no extra profit, and he would get back in exchange only the cost of production. And I promise you, that's not why people get into business, into capitalism. He says he might obtain a greater income from having set in motion a larger capital, but not from having made a greater profit on his capital than the others. Moreover, he attains the object he's aiming at if he prices his goods only a small percentage lower than his competitors. He drives them off the field. He wrests from them at least part of their market by underselling them. I mean, if you're at the market and you're buying a thing, and the same thing is being sold by a competitor right next to them for cheaper, you're going to buy that thing, generally speaking. And over time, the first competitor will be driven out of business if they don't change. and he steals their market from them by underselling them. And that's it. That's the end of capitalism, and we can all go to bed. Wait, hold on. This is the thing, it keeps going. This process keeps going. He says, and finally, let us remember that the current price always stands either above or below the cost of production, according as the sale of a commodity takes place in the favorable or unfavorable period of the industry. According as the market price of the yard of linen stands above or below its former cost of production, will the percentage vary at which the capitalist who has made use of the new and more faithful means of production sell above his real cost of production. But the privilege of our capitalist is not long of duration. That's right. The cycle continues. Rinse and repeat, baby. He says other competing capitalists introduce the same machines, the same division of labor, and introduce them upon the same or even upon a greater scale. And finally, this introduction becomes so universal that the price of the linen is lowered not only below its old, but even below its new cost of production. I love this bit. He goes, the capitalists, therefore, find themselves in their mutual relations in the same situation in which they were before the introduction of the new means of production. And if that doesn't make you want to pull your hair out, I don't know what does. We're caught in the seemingly endless, stupid cycle of capitalists fighting with each other in order to drive down prices, to drive each other out of the market by increasing productive forces, only to end up back where we all started, except this time with more expropriation of surplus labor, with more exploitation, with more economic disparity. It's a flat circle. To digress, I say seemingly endless because, I don't know, sometimes it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine a transition into another historical epoch, that of socialism and communism. But that's just my that's my revolutionary pessimism speaking. To progress, we need to be revolutionary optimists. We need to remember that communism will win. It's our job to make sure we don't destroy our ability to live on this planet before that happens. Marx says, the capitalists find themselves in the same situation in which they were before the introduction of the new means of production. And if they are by these means enabled to offer double the product at the old price, they're now forced to furnish double the product for less than the old price. Having arrived at the new point, the new cost of production, the battle for supremacy in the market has to be fought anew. The cycle begins again. Given more division of labor and more machinery, and there results a greater scale upon which division of labor and machinery are exploited. And competition again brings the same reaction against this result. We're just stuck in this cycle. But every time the cycle restarts, the contradictions get sharper. Well, I hope you enjoyed reading that section with me. If you did, feel free to support my content. It means a lot. It really does. If you're watching the live stream, stick around. And if you're watching the replay, Well, fuck it. Let's just do the next section. We're doing the next section. We'll go right into it. Yeah. And again, if you like my content, one of the best ways to support is to, give me weed. But if you can't do that, give me your money so that I can get weed. Yeah, there you go. One of the best ways to support is on Patreon. You can support for as little as $1. You'll get early access to some of my content, and it really does mean a lot. You could support for $5 a month, and it'll mean 5 times as much to me, and it really does. It does help, and I appreciate you very much. Yeah, why don't you do that? Why don't you go to your Patreon and unsubscribe to a rad lib content creator, and instead subscribe to me. There you go. And that's praxis, baby. Let's get into this next section. Effect of capitalist competition on the capitalist class, the middle class, and the working class. Okay. Away we go. We thus see how the method of production and the means of production are constantly enlarged, revolutionized. How the division of labor necessarily draws after it greater division of labor. The employment of machinery, greater employment of machinery. Work upon a large scale, work upon a still greater scale. That is the law that continually throws capitalist production out of its old ruts and compels capital to strain ever more the productive forces of labor for the very reason that it has already strained them. The law that grants it no respite and constantly shouts in its ear, "March, march." This is no other law than that which, within the periodical fluctuations of commerce, necessarily adjusts the price of a commodity to its cost of production. No matter how powerful the means of production which a capitalist may bring into the field, competition will make their adoption general. So if you introduce some sort of like brand new fucking machine that does revolutionizes your industry, and your competitors will eventually get the same technology. Of course, your hope is to invent new technology before that happens, but that's the point. He says, and from the moment that they have been generally adopted, the sole result of the greater productiveness of his capital will be that he must furnish at the same price 10, 20, 100 times much as before. Just think of like, production of linen. It's the easiest one to imagine. And how that's changed over time, and the bourgeois class just has to produce more. More. He says, but since he must find a market for perhaps 1,000 times as much in order to outweigh the lower selling price by the greater quantity of the sale, since now a more extensive sale is necessary not only to gain a greater profit, but in order to replace the cost of production, the instrument of production itself grows always more costly, as we've seen. And since this more extensive sale has become a question of life and death not only for him, but also for his rivals, the old struggle must begin again. And it is all the more violent and the more powerful the means of production already invented are. You can see how cycle after cycle of this shit It only means more expropriation of surplus labor, more exploitation, more economic disparity. That's going to piss people off. It means the sharpening of contradictions. It increases the likelihood that this contradiction will spill over into open antagonism. And in human society, that means violence. He says, whatever be the power of the means of production which are employed, competition seeks to rob capital of the golden fruits of this power by reducing the price of commodities to the cost of production, in the same measure in which production is cheapened, that is, in the same measure in which more can be produced with the same labor. It compels by a law which is irresistible a still greater cheapening of production, the sale of ever greater masses of product for smaller prices. Thus, the capitalist will have gained nothing more by his efforts than the obligation to furnish a greater product in the same labor time. In a word, more difficult conditions for the profitable employment of his capital. That's what's happening. Those are the conditions the capitalists create. The conditions under which it's harder to make money. Um, I got lost. He says, while competition therefore constantly pursues him with its law of the cost of production, and turns against himself every weapon that he forges against his rivals, the capitalist continually seeks to get the best of competition by restlessly introducing further subdivision of labor and new machines, which, though more expensive, enable him to produce more cheaply, instead of waiting until the new machines shall have been rendered obsolete by the competition. This is remind me how capitalists are more of a series of business decisions than human beings. He says, if we now conceive this feverish agitation as it operates in the market of the whole world, we shall be in a position to comprehend how the growth, accumulation, and concentration of capital bring in their train an ever more detailed subdivision of labor, an ever greater improvement of old machines, and a constant application of new machines. A process which goes on uninterrupted, with feverish haste, and upon an ever more gigantic scale. But what effect do these conditions, which are inseparable from the growth of productive capital, have upon the determination of wages? Because after all, that's what I care about. My pocketbook. The greater division of labor enables one laborer to accomplish the work of 5, 10, or 20 laborers. It therefore increases competition among the laborers fivefold, tenfold, or 20-fold. The laborers compete not only by selling themselves one cheaper than the other, but also by one doing the work of 5, 10, or 20. And they are forced to compete in this manner by the division of labor, which is introduced and steadily improved by capital. So, you should slow down at work, is what Marx says. Work slowly. Furthermore, to the same degree in which the division of labor increases, is the labor simplified. The special skill of the laborer becomes worthless. He becomes transformed into a simple monotonous force of production with neither physical nor mental elasticity. His work becomes accessible to all. Therefore, competitors press upon him from all sides. Moreover, it must be remembered that the more simple, the more easily learned the work is, so much the less is its cost to production, the expense of its acquisition, and so much the lower must the wages sink. For, like the price of any other commodity, they are determined by the cost of production. Therefore, in the same manner in which labor becomes unsatisfactory, more repulsive, do competition increase and wages decrease. The laborer seeks to maintain the total of his wages for a given time by performing more labor, either by working a great number of hours or by accomplishing more in the same number of hours. Thus, urged on by want, he himself multiplies the disastrous effects of division of labor. Marx says capitalism's your fault. He says the result is the more he works, the less wages he receives. Oh, fuck. Hold up. So if you stop working, your wages will go up? I fucking love this. He says, and for this simple reason, the more he works, the more he competes against his fellow workmen, the more he compels them to compete against him and to offer themselves on the same wretched conditions as he does. So that, in the last analysis, he competes against himself as a member of the working class. Oh, fuck. You just can't win. That's nuts, man. The harder you work, the more you hurt the working class. And the more you work, the less you make. Oh, man. Something's got to give here. We got to do something's got to be done, you know? Machinery, he says, produces the same effects, but upon a much larger scale. It supplants skilled laborers by unskilled, men by women, adults by children. All right, I'm not going to unravel that, but you get the idea. He says, where newly introduced, it throws workers upon the streets in great masses. And as it becomes more highly developed and more productive, it discards them in additional through those smaller numbers. In this section, Marx says, the children yearn for the mines. He says, we've hastily sketched in broad outlines the industrial war of capitalists among themselves. This war has the peculiarity that the battles in it are won less by recruiting than by discharging the army of workers. The generals, the capitalists, vie with one another as to who can discharge the greatest number of industrial soldiers. The economists tell us, to be sure, that those laborers who have been rendered superfluous by machinery find new venues of employment. You could start making machines. In the future, everyone will make machines. They dare not assert directly that the same laborers that have been discharged find situations in new branches of labor. Facts cry out too loudly against this lie. Strictly speaking, they only maintain that new means of employment will be found for other sections of the working class, for example, for that portion of the young generation of laborers who are about to enter upon that branch of industry which has just been abolished. Of course, this is a great satisfaction to the disabled laborers. There will be no lack of fresh exploitable blood and muscle for the messieurs capitalists. The dead may bury their dead. This consolation seems to be intended more for the comfort of the capitalists themselves than the laborers. If the whole class of the wage laborer were to be annihilated by machinery, how terrible that would be for capital, which without labor, wage labor, ceases to be capital. But even if we assume that all who are directly forced out of employment by machinery, as well as all of the rising generation who are waiting for a chance of employment in the same branch of industry, do actually find some new employment, are we to believe that this new employment will pay as high wages as did the one they've lost? If it did, it would be in contradiction to the laws of political economy. And even if someone did happen to get a job in a place that paid the same or more, that would be the exception. Generally speaking, this description would be in contradiction to the way the world works, despite the fact that there may be exceptions. Okay? We have seen how modern industry, he says, always tends to be the substitution of the simpler and more subordinate employments for the higher and more complex ones, he says. How then could a mass of workers thrown out of one branch of industry by machinery find refuge in another branch unless they were to be paid more poorly? An exception to the law has been adduced, namely the workers who are employed in the manufacture of machinery itself, like I was just getting at. But again, we can't have it. Not everyone can be the manufacturer of machinery itself. Not everyone can be bourgeoisie. As soon as there is in industry a greater demand for and a greater consumption of machinery, it is said that the number of machines must necessarily increase. Consequently, also the manufacture of machines, consequently also the employment of workers in machine manufacture, and the workers employed in this branch of industry are skilled, even educated workers. Since the year 1840, this assertion, which is still sort of being made today in 2025, right? Oh, well, we just gotta have AI and machines do the work for us. What? Okay. So since the year 1840, this assertion, which even before that date was only half true, has lost all semblance of truth. For the most diverse machines are now applied to the manufacture of the machines themselves on quite as extensive a scale as in the manufacture of cotton yarn, and the laborers employed in machine factories can but play the role of very stupid machines alongside of the highly ingenious machines. But in place of the man who has been dismissed by the machine, the factory may employ, perhaps, 3 children and 1 woman. And must not the wages of the man have previously sufficed for the 3 children and 1 woman? Must not the minimum wages have sufficed for the preservation and propagation of the race? What then do these beloved bourgeois phrases prove? Nothing more than that now 4 times as many workers' lives are used up as there were previously in order to obtain the livelihood of 1 working family. To sum up, the more productive capital grows, the more it extends the division of labor and the application of machinery. The more the division of labor and the application of machinery extend, the more does competition extend among the workers, the more do their wages shrink together. And it's just like, well, who do you identify with in this situation? Do you identify with the masses of workers whose wages are shrinking relatively? Or do you identify with the capitalists whose capital is growing? Their line is going up. You could read this as a set of instructions on how to do capitalism, I'm scared there are people who are. But obviously, if you have any amount of humanity, you're identifying with the group of people who are being exploited, who are forced into this situation, and were not given a choice. They have to sell their labor power in exchange for crumbs. As a slave, Marx says. Reading on, in addition, the working class is also recruited from the higher strata of society. A mass of small businessmen and of people living upon the interests of their capitals is precipitated into the ranks of the working class, and they will have nothing else to do than to stretch out their arms alongside of the arms of the workers. Thus, the forest of outstretched arms begging for work grows ever thicker, while the arms themselves grow ever leaner. Typo. It's evident that the small manufacturer cannot survive in a struggle in which the first condition of success is production upon an ever greater scale. Good luck for the small manufacturer. And it's evident that the small manufacturers, and thereby increasing the number of candidates for the proletariat, all this requires no further elucidation. Finally, in the same measure in which the capitalists are compelled by the movement described above to exploit the already existing gigantic means of production on an ever-increasing scale, and for this purpose to be set in motion all the mainsprings of credit, in the same measure do they increase the industrial earthquakes, in the midst of which the commercial world can preserve itself only by sacrificing a portion of its wealth, its products, and even its forces of production to the gods of the lower world. In short, the crises increase. They become more frequent and more violent, if for no other reason than for this alone, that in the same measure in which the mass of products grows, and therefore the needs for extensive markets, in the same measure does the world market shrink ever more, and ever fewer markets remain to be exploited. Since every previous crisis has subjected to the commerce of the world a hitherto unconquered or but superficially exploited market. But capital not only lives upon labor. Like a master at once distinguished and barbarous, it drags with it into its grave the corpses of its slaves, whole hecatombs of workers who perish in the crises. We thus see that if capital grows rapidly, competition among the workers grows with even greater rapidity. That is, the means of employment and subsistence for the working class decrease in proportion even more rapidly. But this notwithstanding, the rapid growth of capital is the most favorable condition of wage labor. Which is not ideal. He's not saying this is ideal. You have to understand that. And that was Wage, Labor, and Capital by Karl Marx. I hope you enjoyed reading this with me. I did. If you enjoyed this, and if you got a couple bucks laying around, feel free to support. It means a lot. Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who ever has supported. Shout out to everyone who supports on Patreon. Love your face. I appreciate that very much. If you're watching the live stream, stick around. If you're catching the replay, you'll have to read something else. Whatever we read next. Check out another one of our readings. All right.